Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today we're going to take a look at a few more tarot and oracle combinations. Today we're going to be taking a look at decks that really work to balance each other out, or as I like to say a lot of times, decks where the opposites definitely attract. So the first combo that we're going to look at in decks that sort of balance each other out is the Darkness of Light and the Earthbound Oracle. Now these are both indie decks. I do believe this is the out of print edition of the Darkness of Light, but there might be other editions that are available. But really what we're looking at here is tarot and oracle decks that balance each other out in terms of their light and dark. So we're talking not only aesthetically, but also in terms of their messages and their symbolism. And I think this would work well with any sort of darker deck that has a color palette similar to the Darkness of Light. There are some mass market decks out there that do have a sort of similar kind of muted color palette. They're a little bit more, I think it's more of the photo type of decks, but there are some great ones out there that I think would work well for this too. So basically what we're looking at is two decks that really balance each other out in terms of their light and shadow. Now, the reason that I like both of these two decks together is because both decks on their own contain cards of light and shadow. And so we get that really interesting balance where aesthetically speaking, the Darkness of Light Tarot is a bit on the darker side in terms of its color palette, and the Earthbound Oracle is a bit lighter in terms of its color palette. But we really also get this idea of balance between the light and shadow meanings within each of the decks themselves. So here we have the Wheel of Fortune and Fear. So whereas we can see the Wheel of Fortune in more positive light, we could see the card of Fear in a more shadow aspect, even though their color palettes suggest that the wheel is a bit of has a darker look to it, and Fear has a bit of a lighter look to it. So I think it's really interesting when you get decks that sort of balance each other out, not only aesthetically speaking, but also in terms of their messages. So here we have the Moon and the Gift. This particular artwork, we're taking a look at sort of the shadow aspect of the moon, whereas we're looking at more of the unseen things. Sometimes those can be things that it's scary when we can't really tell what we're looking at. But this also reminds us that there can also be gifts in the unseen as well, things that we may not be aware of, little treasures hidden inside, right? Stuff that's hidden in the shadows, those can be little gifts. And so I think that this is really wonderful when we get these kind of images and messages together. So here we have the Tower and Message, all of this destruction and change, but from that comes the message, right? Comes what we need to learn. Hierophant with the Moon. Interesting, right? So aesthetically speaking, these two decks, I think, really balance each other out, not only in terms of the sort of dark energy that is in, or dark artwork that is in the Darkness of Light, and the sort of lighter color palette of the Earthbound Oracle, but also what we get is kind of this busier, more detailed, fuller imagery in the Darkness of Light, which balances out really well with the sort of minimalistic art style of the Earthbound Oracle. And this is something that we'll also be looking at with some other decks. This is definitely a deck that I tend to look at more in the pairing of light and shadow. So again, just two decks that I really enjoy pairing together because I think they work really well to balance each other out. And as I've mentioned in a couple of other videos, there are other things that you can look for too besides just the imagery and the words on the cards to help you kind of create those connections. You can also look for colors. So the branch here in this creativity card almost has a bit of a purpley pink color tone to it, which we see reflected here in the background in the King of Wands. So that's always interesting too. So here we have the Six of Coins and Life. Again, the sun behind there almost looks like one of these coins. So we can kind of pull in those sort of shapes and symbols into our interpretation, as well as just looking at the Six of Coins in terms of new life growing. What's going to come out of this Six of Coins? What is going to grow and prosper from that? So I think that's really beautiful when we can do that. So one of my favorite combos for that kind of light-dark balance, that light-shadow balance, is the Darkness of Light Tarot and the Earthbound Oracle. So another two decks that I think do a really good job of balancing each other out, not only just in terms of light and dark, because we have these very black cards in the Wanderer's Tarot and the whiter border on the Sacred Destiny Oracle that really kind of gives it that black-white balance here that we see. It works really well in terms of light and shadow, but really where I see the balance between these two decks is looking at the outer world versus the inner world. So the Sacred Destiny kind of represents that outer world landscape, whereas the Wanderer Tarot really represents that inner world landscape. So the Wanderer's Tarot is also a pip style deck, and when we combine that or pair that with the sort of photo, I don't want to say busyness, but the complexity of the artwork in the Sacred Destiny, we get again that really nice sort of balancing each other out, where we have the more minimalistic imagery in one deck and the more detailed or expressive imagery in the other deck. And I think that these two decks work really well together for that very reason. But really what I think these two decks do really well together is to help us to balance what's going on in the outer world, which we see here in the Sacred Destiny, versus what's going on in our own personal inner world, which we see reflected here in the Wanderer's Tarot. On an aesthetic level, these two decks really kind of always blow me away whenever I put them together. They look really beautiful, and the messages themselves really also help to kind of balance each other out. Although, to be perfectly honest, I pay more attention to what's going on in the artwork in both. So here we have this Goddess of Knives who's kind of like in all of the brush here, and she's really down deep into the earth. She kind of almost looks like a scarecrow in the way that she's kind of built together, and she has a little hat to balance that kind of sharp energy of this Goddess of Knives. Here we have this beautiful imagery with these birds and these clouds, and they're all taking flight. So we have a definite sense of opposites sort of attract here, and that's really a lot of what the key will be in these pairings. Is most of the time they're very opposite of each other, and so they really help to sort of balance each other out. And I really love how the white borders on the Sacred Destiny really helps pull out the white line work in the Wanderer's Tarot. I think they work really well together. I have seen a lot of people trim this deck, and I do think it looks really pretty trimmed. But because this is the way I primarily use this deck is in a way to balance my darker decks. I really like the white borders. It really kind of creates like a framework, like a Polaroid, if you will, because I see this more as like a reflection of the outer world, whereas the tarot decks that I tend to pair it with tend to be more of a reflection of my inner world. So again, another two decks that I think do really well to balance each other out because they are complete opposites of each other. It's kind of with these two decks, it's like that opposites attract. So that is the Wanderer's Tarot and the Sacred Destiny Oracle. So the next two decks are really a balance of each other because we have this idea of kind of chaos and calm. So in this particular pairing, we're looking at the Paulina Tarot and the Hedwig Botanical Oracle. Now, we've seen this deck a couple of times because I think it is a great deck for creating white space and for creating calm within a reading. So one of the things that I like to do with my tarot and oracle pairings is to combine my sort of calmer oracle decks with my busier tarot, or vice versa. So we definitely get that idea of calm and chaos, that kind of yin and yang balance. We have a lot of white because I've left the borders on the Paulina Tarot and a lot of white space on the Hedwig Botanical, but the art styles are totally different, and we have a very rich, detailed artwork here in the Paulina Tarot, and of that more minimalistic line drawing artwork in the Hedwig Botanical Oracle. And so I think that they really help to kind of balance each other out in the fact that the Paulina can be a little bit overwhelming. This artwork is very, very detailed. I love this deck and I love working with it, but it can be a little much. And so pulling in a kind of calmer, more focused oracle deck can really help to create some space in your reading, but can also help you to kind of focus in on what's going on within the reading. So here we have the Three of Pentacles, and we have a lot of texture, a lot of color, a lot of detail going on within this Three of Pentacles. And over here we have this hollyhock that is this card of abundance with the one big blooming flower in the center and all that lovely white space behind it. And I think that really does help to kind of balance out this almost chaotic energy of this Three of Pentacles, and helps balance it and bring in some calm with this abundance through this illustration of the hollyhock. Now, the other thing that I have pointed out many times is that we can also look for, picking up colors and those colors and what do they mean. And so that can be really interesting to kind of look for those places where you can sort of make those comparisons and see where those messages can expand from. So here we have the Nine of Swords with connection. Again, we have this beautiful, really detailed imagery here. And we see that rather than just having the 9 swords above her head, we have this almost like ghostly like figure. And what's really interesting is that we have the keyword of connection here. So this idea of really connecting with those fears, right? Really understanding and diving deep into where they come from. I think that's a really beautiful message to look into. And so these are two decks that I really do like to pair together because they do have completely opposite energies. The Paulina is very rich, very detailed. It has a lot of energy. There's a lot going on within each of these cards. And the Hedge Witch Botanical is very calm, very grounded, very subdued. And they really do help to kind of create this lovely balance within a reading. They help create some breathing space, because a lot of these cards together can create for a very full energetic reading, which is wonderful. But sometimes you need to kind of create that space so that you can sink into each of the cards and the messages and how they interact together. And a deck like the Hedge Witch Botanical with all the white space is really beautiful. Can you see the mimicking colors here as well? We have these little the little leaves of the plant here almost kind of mimic these swords, the green swords. We have the yellow that in the flowers that mimics the yellow in her dress. I love picking up little details like that. I think that can really help to create a really wonderful reading. Look at this one with the 10 of Wands and build, right? That's an excellent keyword for the 10 of Wands just on its own. But let's look at the imagery. Let's look at the artwork. We have these cattails that almost mimic the wands that he's carrying. And rather than the cattails being on the sort of back of the plant, they're on the front side. So it's more like the wands are carrying the plant if this were the person. And I hope you're following me because this is kind of really getting into the weeds here. But for me, this particular card, the arrangement of the illustration, the colors, the mimicking of colors that we see in both of these cards really reminds me that while he's carrying his heavy load on his back, it's also what's going to help him build his whatever he's going to build with that. So this really, really shows to me that like one supports the other. They're almost a mirror of each other, where the heavy load is on the top here, and then here the heavy load is underneath. And so it really creates a really interesting balance where it reminds us that, carrying that big heavy burden can be what helps us build the thing that we're trying to create. And I think that's just absolutely wonderful. Queen of Pentacles with service. I mean, how beautiful is this? That flower itself almost mimics her. It's like if this Queen of Pentacles were created into a flower, or into, I guess this is really garlic, but into this illustration here. I mean, it does kind of look like her. We have these little petals out here, or these little leaves that aren't colored, that almost look like her little wings. We have the greenery here that, kind of mimics what's going on around her in her dress. We have this little flower burst at the top that mimics her hair. I mean, so cool just to look at just how the illustrations really kind of play off of each other. It's really wonderful. So another really great pairing for kind of that busy and calm, or that what I like to call it is chaos and calm. And when I say chaos here, I don't necessarily mean chaos in a bad way. I just mean chaos as in a lot of dynamic energy going on. Whereas with the Hedwig Botanical, we have a much more calmer, more subdued energy within the cards, and they really do help to balance each other out. So that was the Paulina Tarot and the Hedwig Botanical Oracle. So next, let's take a look at two decks that balance each other out in terms of their energy as being kind of very down in the earth and very up in the cosmos. So this is the Anna K Tarot, and this is the Blue Messiah and Cosmic reading cards mixed together into one deck, but it is actually two different oracle decks, both by the same creator. One of the things that I really like about this particular pairing is that it has a very much as above, so below feeling to me. Like when we are looking at what's going on in the earthly realm and what's going on in the cosmic realm. So here we have the Wheel of Fortune with soul travel. So for me, that really gives the idea of the soul is what is going around and around and around the, traveling on the wheel. It's not so much about the mundane, but the bigger, maybe lifetime after lifetime, your karmic cycle, so to speak. And so this particular pairing, I think, really gives us that really deep earthy energy, really balanced out with that sort of higher vibration, cosmic energy. And I think that in that sense, they pair really well together. Their art styles are completely different. Their energies are completely different. The Anna K is very devoid of any sort of esoterica. It's more earthly, it's more human. Really, this is my human deck. And the Blue Messiah and Cosmic reading cards very much have that otherworldly type of energy. And so the two together really do create that sort of balance of the as above, so below, or maybe what's, going on in your human world versus what's going on in your soul world. And I think that they work really beautiful in that sense. And I really like to pull these two decks together to really tap into what's going on a human level versus what's going on a soul level, or what's going on the lower frequency, right, on the mundane world versus what's going on that higher frequency, or that sort of, almost magical realm, if you will. I think they work really well together, not so much in a sense of kind of balancing each other out, but more in a sense of bringing those two aspects together into one reading. So we're kind of bringing the human and the cosmic. You could even look at it as the human and the divine, or the earthly realm and the cosmic realm. And I think that it works really beautifully in this sense. And I love pairing them together in this way because it really creates some interesting readings in terms of looking at things from those two very different perspectives. These two decks almost have two different frequencies to them. And you get both of those frequencies coming together in this really interesting way when you use them together in a reading. So another two decks that I think really pair well together because, again, they have totally opposite energies. They almost exist on a totally different level. So that is the Anna K Tarot and the Blue Messiah reading cards, as well as the Cosmic reading cards. So let's take a look at another two decks that kind of have that same sort of as above, so below energy to them, but also very much that inner and outer power energy. So this is the Tarot of the She, and this is my completely trimmed copy. It's just completely down to the artwork, and the Shamanic Healing Oracle cards. Now, I think these two decks work together really well because they do have a sort of similar art style. It's very primitive, very raw. They're quite compatible in a lot of ways, but they are quite different in a lot of ways as well. So we have a lot of big, bright, bold colors in the Tarot of the She, and a lot more of a muted color palette in the Shamanic Healing. And so they are a little bit of an opposite, but they also share some similarities, which I think makes them pair together really well. And I have thought about trimming this deck completely down to its artwork because I think it would really pair beautifully to have both of them be completely borderless. But I do quite like the keywords on the shamanic healing, so I've left it. But one of the things that I really like about this particular pairing is similar to the pairing that we just saw. This one really does get the sort of as above, so below, inner and outer world is kind of how I look at it. Whereas the Tower of the She is really kind of all about your interpersonal power, and then the shamanic healing oracle is more about how you manifest that power in the outer world. So I think it's really interesting when you pair the decks together like this. Again, we could pick up on colors, we could pick up on line work, we could find similarities within each of the cards within the artwork itself. But I think that should not be upside down. But I think where this particular pairing works really beautiful is, again, like I said, taking that inner power expressed through the Tarot of the She and seeing how it needs to manifest outward in the world through this shamanic healing. You could also look at this as what healing needs to be done in order to manifest that inner power as well. So I think that's, I don't know why half the cards are upside down. So I think that works really well too, is to look at it from both of those aspects. So another kind of contrast to these two decks, or way they sort of balance each other out, similar to the Paulina and the Hedge Witch, is that we have a lot going on in the Tarot of the She, right? It's really busy. There's a lot of texture. There's a lot of color. There's a lot of movement. And then compare that to the shamanic healing, where we have a lot more simple imagery, more simple line work, simple colors. It's just a lot less. It's kind of a bit calmer. So we also get that balance in terms of kind of that calm and chaos as well. Like this is all the chaos going on inside of you. And again, when I say chaos, I don't mean bad chaos. I'm not talking like tower energy chaos. How could you kind of control that and bring that into something that you can actually use and manifest outward in the world? I think that's really beautiful. So another two decks that I think really work to balance each other out, that kind of opposites attract, but they do have some similarities that really help them create a very cohesive reading. And I think that really helps them to work well together and to have a wonderful conversation. And like I said, I think the shamanic healing really does help to kind of rein in the energy of the Tarot of the She. I mean, sometimes we want all that energy. We need that big explosion, but sometimes we just need it in smaller doses, need it to be a little bit more focused. And I think the Shamanic Healing Oracle does an excellent job of that. So again, that's the Tarot of the She and the Shamanic Healing Oracle. So the last few combos that I want to talk about are decks that kind of have a real surreal balance to them. And here is an excellent example of that. We have the Wooden Tarot that is all about the weird, the abstract, the surreal, and the Messages from the Light meditation deck that shows us more of the real world and things that are a little bit more applicable in daily life. And so while aesthetically speaking, these two decks may not necessarily go together, although I do think that sometimes like the pairings are really pretty. They do look really kind of pretty. I mean, pretty as pretty does, as they say, but they do look really, really pretty when you put the Messages from Your Light in the middle and the Wooden Tarot around it, and you build a reading out that way, kind of like a flower. Oh, it's so pretty. That's a great one to do. But here we have this really surreal imagery for the lovers with this a little bit more down into the mundane, into the real world of dream work. So the idea of taking this energy of the lovers and applying it in the sense of dream work. And so it kind of gives you an idea of how to apply the messages that you're receiving, these sort of surreal just left of center messages. How can you take that and kind of apply that in a real sense? And I think for this, the Messages from the Light works really well for that. There are other couple of decks that I think would probably work really well. The Tao Oracle probably would be another one that would work really wonderfully for this, because again, it's more in the more modern, more realistic, whereas the Wooden Tarot is definitely more about the surreal. It's about looking at things from a different perspective, which is fantastic, but you have to be able to apply that in a real world sense. And so I think that pairing decks together in this way can really help you to kind of understand what to do with that energy. So here we have the Three of Plumes and meditation. So here we have this imagery of all the arrows going into the heart. You know, we can talk about the three in terms of heartbreak and maybe spending some time meditating. You can see here that the heart chakra is lit up in this card. So this is really talking more about, you know, spending some time meditating on maybe what is going on within yourself, within your heart. Maybe talking about those things that you need to open up to expand expand your mind, expand your point of view. And you can see here with the lotus that is opening up in place of the head. I think that really does tie into that energy really well. If we think of the three in a more numerological sense, we think of it in terms of growth. You know, we have the one and the one come together to create the three. That's a number of growth. That's a number of kind of blossoming and blooming. And we see that reflected really beautifully here in meditation. Here we have the Chariot with patience. I mean, how perfect are those two cards together? I love this Chariot card. I've talked about it many times, how the Chariot doesn't always have to be fast moving. It can be slow moving as long as you're still moving forward. That's really what counts. And it reminds us that, you know, this takes patience. It takes patience to follow your destiny, if you will, to follow your path. It's not something that happens overnight. And these two together really remind us that it's going to take patience to really step into and to really allow that Chariot energy to manifest itself in our lives. And I think these two decks work really well together. Again, you can start pulling in. I love when the imagery just comes up. We have this spiral, kind of horn spiral in the center here, and we have this shooting of energy that is coming up here from the center. We could also see these energy reflecting out, could kind of mimic this idea of the stones here mimicking out. So we get this idea of protection, right? This idea of protection of above and below, because we have the horn in the crystals really rooted down into the earth. And then we have this sort of almost angelic looking like imagery here, and the idea of protection from above and below, or protection within and without. Death and surrender. I mean, how perfect are these two? In order to step into that change, we have to accept death. We have to surrender to it. You know, maybe this is her soul moving on after the death, or her just opening up to a new way of being after the death of old ideas. I think that's really wonderful. And so much you could tie into, like the imagery. We have the clouds here. We have the clouds reflected here as well in this card. This little statue in the center could be reminiscent of this weird two-eyed, or I guess four eyes, because you'd have two on each side, kind of swan-like figure here. We have this gorgeous butterfly, this idea of like transformation, of opening, of knowing. I think that's just gorgeous. I think they play together really well. And it's two decks that you probably wouldn't think to pair together because they are so very different. The Wooden Tarot is very much all about the surreal, the sort of left of center. And the Messages from the Light is very much grounded in the work that we can do here and now. And I think to take those two ideas and to blend them together into one reading is just absolutely gorgeous. Oh, look at this, the High Priestess with completion. I mean, doesn't that almost look like an ocean, like a sunset over the ocean? We could imagine this High Priestess like jumping out of this ocean. Just that knowing your inner self, being connected to that inner self, that's completion. That is being at whole with yourself. I think that's beautiful. So another two decks that I think really fall into that sort of opposites attract type of energy. They really help to balance each other out with taking that surreal ideas, that surreal symbology that we see in the Wooden Tarot, and balancing that out with actual real world applications that we find in the Messages from the Light meditation deck. I think they just work really beautifully together. Again, I think that you could use any sort of deck that kind of falls into that surreal category with any sort of deck that really gets down to the nitty gritty of everyday life. And I think that would work beautifully together. So this is the Wooden Tarot and the Messages from the Light meditation deck. So another two decks that really do kind of focus in on those two different worlds is the Hidden Realms, or Tower of a Hidden Realm. I'd never know which way it is. The Tower of a Hidden Realm and the Yogic Path Oracle. So this is, again, two totally different style decks. The Tower of a Hidden Realm is really about diving into kind of that what I see is kind of almost like real earthy fae energy. This is not like little Disney fairies. This is like big, large as life fae energy. I'm not an expert on fae at all, so please take that with a grain of salt, but that's just kind of how it feels to me. And then we have the Yogic Path, which is very much in our world. So it feels a lot like these two decks are the magical realm coming together with the mundane realm. And that's kind of how I see this little balancing, this little pair, because even though they have two totally different art styles, this is all gorgeously illustrated artwork, and this is beautiful collage work. They are totally different. They have totally different energies, totally different aesthetics, and yet they really work well together to be able to kind of balance each other out in pulling that otherworldly energy into our world. And so I think these two decks work really beautifully for that. It's a sort of odd pairing, I will have to say. When I first thought to pair these two decks together, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I don't even think that that's going to work. But they actually kind of do. And I think it's because that they are so very opposite that I think they work really well to kind of balance each other out, because the Tower of a Hidden Realm is really stepping into a different world, whereas the Yogic Path is really about grounding into our world. And so it takes these two energies and brings them together into one, which is really interesting. I do have to say that with the keywords on the Yogic Path, I do always have to refer to the guidebook because I have to look them up. But I think overall they do work really beautifully together, and they really bring in that kind of, like I said, the magic and the mundane, the otherworldly and our world. And I think they work really wonderful in that sense. But yeah, it's just, I don't even know what to say about it. It's odd, but it totally works. And my point to kind of showing two decks that this whole like odd combo here is to kind of show that sometimes it pays to take two decks that you don't think would pair at all together and to actually go ahead and put them together and to see what comes out of that. Because I think these two actually work really well together, and it's not something, you know, when I'm just looking through my decks and my shelves, it's not a pairing that I would ever really think to make. But I do like to, when I come across things like that where I'm like, oh, this might be a really weird pairing, I do always like to try it, because sometimes you get really interesting kind of weird cohesion between the two. It's a really hard thing to put into words. I hope that maybe I'm just not totally like off my rocker here and you all are thinking like, what are you talking about? These two decks don't go together at all. Maybe you will see in it what I see, maybe you won't. But my point being is that don't be afraid to experiment with your decks. Don't be afraid to take two decks that really don't look like they should go together and to put them together and to see what comes out of it. There's sometimes some really interesting readings, some really interesting revelations can come out of putting things together that you wouldn't think would go together. So one of the fun things about pairing decks like this is just to take some of those that you don't necessarily think would pair well together and put them together and see what happens. You know, those decks that like they have the same artwork or they're by the same creator and they just, you know, you can just immediately look at them and tell, yep, those two decks are going to read well together. You know, those are all great and I love to use those too. I particularly love decks that pair well together aesthetically. But sometimes it can be really interesting to take two decks that really shouldn't go together, that really don't belong, and to put them together and see what comes of it, because sometimes you will find surprises. I hope you enjoyed this look at some of my favorite tarot and oracle pairings that work to balance each other out, as well as some combos where opposites really do attract. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.